Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar on the new developments in international treaties on nuclear weapons, specifically the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. My name is Chris Rostampor, and I'm the Policy and Communications Coordinator with the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction, coming to you from the Arms Control Association's office in Washington, D.C. And I'm here with three wonderful panelists, which I'm going to introduce to you shortly. But before that, I'll just explain that this webinar is hosted by the Physicists Coalition for the Nuclear Threat Reduction in partnership with the Arms Control Association. To give you some background about the organizers, the coalition was founded in 2019 with a grant from the American Physical Society's Innovation Fund. And until October 2022, the coalition operated with the support of APS to reach out to physicists to educate them on nuclear weapons issues and mobilize those interested in opportunities for nuclear threat reduction. This has been done through webinars advocating for sensible nuclear policies. In addition, we provide colloquia on nuclear issues to physicists and engineering departments and national labs. We take pride in having our wonderful project team members organize over 100 of these colloquia so far, and we look forward to organizing more of them in the future. Please let us know if you'd like your institution to host one of these colloquia. Since October 2022, after completing its planned startup phase with the American Physics Society, the coalition started working independently from the APS and in partnership with the Arms Control Association. Since then, we have transitioned key activities and features of the coalition to the ACA and have been working together to assess and strengthen the coalition's capacity for advocacy aimed at reducing the threat of nuclear weapons. One recent action, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more after this session, is a statement that condemns all threats to use nuclear weapons, which comes from scientists. So if you're a scientist or a graduate student in a scientific field, we urge you to join us in signing this statement after this webinar. We also feel very strongly that a new generation of physics community should become informed, engaged, and active with regards to nuclear issues. And we have done this through our fellowship program, which aims to train the next generation of citizen scientists. Again, after the webinar, I'm going to give you some more information on that. But today, for this event, we plan on staying with you until 2:30, and we plan on posting a recording of this webinar on the coalition's website in case you can't stay for the whole event, and we'll make sure to include that recording in our November newsletter. If you join the coalition as a member, you will receive a notification about that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our knowledgeable and expert group of panelists today who are going to be talking about the new international developments on nuclear weapons, particularly new treaties on or new developments in international treaties on nuclear weapons. We have today with us Zia Mian, who is a physicist and co-director of Princeton University's program on science and global security. He has made presentations at the August 2022 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference and the first meeting of state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, which was concluded in June. We also have with us Randy Rydell, a former senior political affairs officer for the UN's High Representative for Disarmament Affairs and a staff member working on non-proliferation in the US Senate. Since his retirement in 2014, he served as the executive advisor to Mayors for Peace, managed by the Hiroshima Peace Culture Foundation. We also have with us Ray Atchison, who has been providing analysis on arms control diplomacy at the United Nations and other international forums for over a decade as the head of Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. They are currently a visiting researcher at Princeton program on science and global security, and a steering group member of the International Campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, I can. We would ask you that throughout this webinar, if you have questions, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions instead of the chat. We will make sure, or we will do our best to answer all questions. Without further ado, we're going to go to our first panelist, Randy Rydell. Randy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I want to say I'm deeply grateful for the organizers of this webinar for inviting me to speak on the NPT today. I also wish to salute your many efforts to address the great nuclear challenges we face today and to find productive ways to overcome them. One of my honors at the UN's Office for Disarmament Affairs was the opportunity to examine day-to-day disarmament issues in their wider contexts. This work was appropriate given the many constraints facing the UN in seeking progress in nuclear disarmament, a subject that remains very much within the sole decision-making authority of our member states, notably those that possess such weapons. Working at the UN, we all understood this reality, though we still had many opportunities to attempt to influence debates, raise questions, advise member states, undertake research, compile statistics, and engage with civil society and the media to move the nuclear disarmament agenda forward as best we could. And so I'd like to make an effort today to continue this tradition by discussing the NPT, a treaty that President Lyndon Johnson described as, quote, the most important international agreement since the beginning of the nuclear age, unquote. Now, what could he have possibly meant by this? Was it a gracious tribute to it as a huge accomplishment, or a sad commentary on the status of those earlier agreements? To respond, I've got to consider some evolving trends in this field, in particular the cyclic or dialectical nature of the changes in the various disarmament proposals over the years. After the end of World War II, the UN pursued a two-track approach. The General Assembly's first resolution in January 1946 called for the total elimination of, quote, atomic weapons, unquote, and all other weapons adaptable to mass destruction. It soon also focused on the separate challenge of the, quote, regulation of armaments, unquote. Hence, the words nuclear and WMD disarmament appeared early alongside conventional arms control as key UN goals and have remained so ever since. This distinction is not surprising as it mirrors language found in the UN Charter. In 1952, the UN formed the Disarmament Commission and asked it to work out on a treaty addressing both goals. By the end of that decade, with no progress on such a treaty, the General Assembly put General and Complete Disarmament, or GCD, on its agenda for the first time. With this step, the Assembly endorsed what is properly called a comprehensive approach, one that combined WMD disarmament, conventional arms control, limits on military spending and arms exports, and a revival of interest in advancing the primary norms of the Charter regarding the peaceful settlement of disputes and against the threat or use of force. In 1961, the US and USSR even agreed on some common principles called the McCloy-Zorin Joint Statement that embraced GCD. Yet, a cyclic shift in international deliberations was also underway, as darkly hinted in the small print of the US proposal, which called for GCD, quote, in a peaceful world, unquote. In other words, peace must precede disarmament. The major focus in the years to come would be on so-called partial measures, which fell well short of disarmament, but were widely viewed as contributing incrementally to the ultimate goal. These included treaties on establishing nuclear weapon-free zones, non-proliferation, many risk reduction measures, including hotlines, test bans, crisis management schemes, transparency improvements, advanced notifications, export controls, and other actions. By the mid-1960s, a US official in the Pentagon, Roswell Gilpatrick, was asked by the Johnson White House to chair a committee to evaluate whether nuclear nonproliferation per se should be a goal of US policy. Its unanimous verdict was positive, and this helped pave the way for the US to enter into negotiations with the USSR on a draft NPT. Negotiations were completed in Geneva with some amendments by the body later called the Conference on Disarmament, amendments that addressed both disarmament and peaceful uses of nuclear energy. What emerged was a treaty that rested on three proverbial pillars: nuclear nonproliferation, peaceful uses as an inalienable right, and disarmament, both nuclear and GCD. The NPT to this day remains the only treaty that establishes a legally binding obligation on the nuclear weapon states to undertake negotiations in good faith on disarmament. And in 1996, the International Court of Justice issued its famous advisory opinion clarifying that this obligation included the duty to bring such negotiations to a conclusion. At the time it entered into force in 1970, the NPT was the culmination of a drift toward the partial measures approach to disarmament. Others would follow, including many contemporary proposals that focus on merely reducing the risk of nuclear war. Measures such as no first use doctrines, limiting the role of nuclear weapons to the sole purpose of nuclear deterrence, new caps on deployments of strategic nuclear weapons, some limited improvements on transparency issues, and other palliative measures falling far short of disarmament. Yet advocates of a more comprehensive approach, especially among developing countries, never gave up. In 1978, the first special session of the General Assembly on Disarmament established GCD as the organization's formal ultimate goal and clarified its comprehensive scope while recognizing nuclear disarmament as the highest priority. Today, however, partial measures remain by far the primary focus of attention in the world community. There has been, to be sure, some profound disappointment with the NPT as a means to achieve nuclear disarmament, as quite apparent in statements made at all of the treaty review conferences, and also persisting concerns about proliferation. At no time has any nuclear treaty ever required the physical destruction of a single nuclear weapon. We have instead various caps on deployments of strategic weapons and only on some countries. At no time have the nuclear weapon states fulfilled their NPT obligation to undertake disarmament negotiations. They have also failed to address nuclear weapon delivery systems, a subject found in the NPT's preamble, while funding huge programs to modernize these systems and their related bombs and warheads. There are also 9 countries now that possess such weapons instead of the 5 recognized possessor states. Proliferation risks remain intense in the Middle East, South Asia, and Northeast Asia, where the world has been witnessing repeated North Korean missile tests and rumors of a resumption of nuclear testing. Meanwhile, many developing countries claim that their inalienable right to peaceful uses includes fuel cycle technologies of enrichment and reprocessing, the technologies that gave us the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. It was this growing malaise in the world community that support began to grow for a treaty to complement the NPT by reinforcing its unimplemented disarmament obligation. A new treaty that placed strong emphasis on the relevance of international humanitarian law as a basis for moving forward with disarmament. We will hear more on the Treaty and Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons today. Disarmament historians will note that existing treaties, resolutions, and authoritative joint statements have stressed the importance of 5 desirable qualities that future treaties should embody, namely verification, transparency, irreversibility, universality, and of course, bindingness in law. Ideally, though the treaty ratification process and through the treaty ratification process and implementation, these obligations should be reflected in domestic laws, policies, priorities, institutions, plans, and budgets. Yet we have scant evidence of such congruence today. Even advocates of the TPNW do not claim that it will suffice to achieve global nuclear disarmament. in terms of satisfying all these criteria. A logical next step in this evolutionary process would appear to be a comprehensive nuclear weapon convention, or a framework of agreements with a similar goal satisfying these 5 treaty qualities, the gold standard. Yet both the Nuclear Weapon Convention and the TPNW fall well short of the internationally agreed ultimate goal of general and complete disarmament, an advocacy goal that has largely fallen onto the shoulders of civil society. And until then, only a tiny fraction of that society, with the noticeable exception of the SCRAP initiative based at the University of London that stands for the Strategic Concept for the Removal of Arms and Proliferation. The fear among many groups and member states alike is that GCD has for too long been used as a rhetorical weapon by possessor states to rationalize their lack of progress on disarmament, an enterprise that, in their view, must always await the dawning of world peace as a prerequisite. This eclipse of comprehensive disarmament is most unfortunate because GCD adheres most closely to the legal obligations under the Charter. It also offers concrete solutions to many of the most commonly voiced criticisms of nuclear disarmament, namely, that it would leave the world vulnerable to conventional wars, that countries would cheat, that alliances would fragment, that proliferation would be encouraged, and that other allegations that former UN Disarmament Undersecretary Sergio Duarte once summed up as the dirty dozen, unquote. The ambitious scope of GCD would go far in rebutting all of these bogus arguments. For disarmament advocates, the consistent goal here would be to pursue WMD disarmament and conventional arms control on parallel tracks, while also intensifying support for the fulfillment of the Charter's norms on peaceful settlement of disputes and against threats and use of force. These efforts could result in significant improvements in the UN's institutional resources to advance such goals, including enhancements in fact-finding, mediation, arbitration, use of the Secretary General's good offices, and increased support for peace building and disarmament as high priority UN goals. To some extent, the current UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been trying to do just that. Notice that my conclusion here strongly emphasized the relevance of treaties in advancing disarmament. At the UN, we used to call this bringing the rule of law to disarmament, achievable through improving accountability for fulfilling disarmament commitments, a solemn responsibility that has not at all well been performed in past NPT review conferences, through encouragement of universality of membership and compliance with existing treaties, and through the pursuit of new treaties and on related subjects, including conventional arms, military spending, space weapons, all kinds of nuclear weapon delivery systems, cyber weapons, lethal autonomous weapons, weapons testing, hypervelocity weapons, and other destabilizing weaponry. While some can be pursued as partial measures, there is a case for finding ways to incorporate multiple weapons issues within a single comprehensive framework. In this respect, nobody has proposed a compelling alternative to GCD as such a framework. It is a wheel that does not need to be reinvented, just employed. This will require sustained efforts by member states, strong institutional support from the UN itself, and of course, civil society, which I hope will inspire many contributions from the Physicists Coalition on Nuclear Threat Reduction. I encourage you all not to balk at the immense complexity of the disarmament challenges that lie ahead. I urge you to contribute all you can to overcome them. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ray, for that thorough introduction, for walking us through the history of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, and giving us insight to the components of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as well as other disarmament efforts. Our next speaker, Ray Atchison, is going to talk about the NPT Review Conference, the recent one, and also talk about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was brought up in the earlier remarks by Randy. Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and apologize to everybody. There is some construction going on outside my window, so I hope it's not too disruptive. It kind of comes and goes. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate, and thank you, Randy, for that introduction to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I've been asked to speak a little bit about the dynamic conclusion of the latest review conference to the NPT. So every 5 years, the treaty is reviewed, and there's some preparatory committees in the years intervening. But basically, the review process is an opportunity for all of the states parties to come together to discuss what's working, what's not working in terms of implementation. As you can imagine, these are extremely fraught meetings and have been increasingly so over the last 2 review cycles. In 2010, that was the last time that we had a consensus outcome from an NPT review conference with an action plan and agreements for further implementation. Since then, there has not been any agreement achieved. In 2015, the US, UK, and Canada blocked the adoption of an outcome agreement on Israel's behest. Israel's not a state party to the NPT, but they did not like the language on the Middle East, and so had their proxies block that outcome. The next review conference was supposed to be 2020, but was postponed multiple times due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and was finally held in New York in August this year. This time it was Russia that blocked the adoption of the outcome document. And it stood alone in terms of refusing to accept the consensus adoption, but there's more to the story, as you can imagine. So the war in Ukraine, of course, was the backdrop to this review conference. So very different terrain than if the conference had been held earlier, difficult to predict how it might have gone. But given Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, that was sort of the overhanging shadow or cloud, if you will, that really made things increasingly complicated in an already complicated landscape. And so at the end of the day, Russia did not accept some of the language around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as well as nuclear threats and some other language in the document. But the entire month of negotiations was very difficult and challenging. There was an attempt by who are sort of called the P3, which is Russia, the UK, the UK, the US, and France, as opposed to Russia and China. So this P3 group of nuclear armed states tried to create this dichotomy between what they consider to be responsible and irresponsible nuclear armed states. So this has always been a thing, but it's mostly been between those who are part of the NPT and those who are not part of the NPT, whereas now they've created this mini club within the 5, and really tried to denounce Russia's behavior with nuclear weapons in particular, as well as with the war at large, and create kind of a hierarchy of what is responsible rhetoric and action when it comes to nuclear weapons. And so in the end, the draft outcome document, which was not adopted, it didn't even condemn nuclear threats overall. It only included language around inflammatory rhetoric, which was a way for the P3 to assert that their threats to use nuclear weapons, which are often more implicit or embedded within nuclear deterrence theory and their nuclear postures, is more responsible than overt references to the potential use of nuclear weapons in the context of war. The other main sticking point throughout the negotiations was really around disarmament itself. And here, all of the nuclear armed states that are party to the NPT, all 5 of them, they fought all references to past nuclear disarmament commitments. Several of them objected to a reference to a 1996 International Court of Justice opinion about the legal obligation of the NPT nuclear armed states to eliminate their nuclear weapons. All 5 nuclear armed states attempted to condition everything in the outcome document, citing that the international security environment is not ripe for nuclear disarmament, so they can't possibly get rid of their nuclear weapons in this context. Of course, no reference at all to the fact that these 5 states, more than anyone else in the world, is creating the international security environment, and the fact that as the rest of the world believes, that getting rid of nuclear weapons would actually help alleviate some of these tensions and, of course, the capacity to commit mass violence and genocide. So this was a particular sort of tension that is inherent within the NPT, but has escalated in this current moment. There's also been, of course, an escalation of tension that's been very deliberately manufactured in terms of not just the P3 versus Russia, but also China. The US, UK, Australia alliance, which will involve the sharing of nuclear materials and nuclear powered submarines, raised a lot of attention at this NPT conference. Nuclear sharing in terms of US nuclear weapons being hosted by certain NATO states in Europe got more attention than ever before in the NPT context as well. And really the only thing where there was even the minimalist progress, and I use that word very tentatively, was in terms of what's called nuclear risk reduction. So rather than disarmament, focusing on what minimalist steps could the nuclear armed states take to possibly reduce the risk of the use of nuclear weapons. So things like transparency measures or alert level status. There was nothing new that was in this outcome document that hadn't already been discussed and agreed upon, say, back in 2010. But these were the only things that sort of made it into this draft outcome that wasn't adopted in the end. The other problematic element to be aware of with this NPT outcome that was not adopted, we might think, okay, well, the next review cycle is going to be a chance to start over. But unfortunately, what we just saw at the UN General Assembly's first committee, which focuses on disarmament and ran throughout the entirety of October and into November, was an attempt by Japan working with the United States to take language selectively from this failed outcome document, put it into a resolution, and sort of purport for this to be the basis for the next review cycle. So unfortunately, this very minimalist document that was extremely fraught, not supported by many countries in the world, was sort of something that they were going to go along with in order to stabilize the NPT regime and not have a second failure after 2015, that there is going to be this attempt in the years to come to use this as what's achievable. So we're not starting from a great position. Now, none of this is really new. And those of you who have followed the NPT for many years, this might sound very familiar. These tensions, the sort of hierarchies, the attempts to one-up each other, and the hypocrisy of it all probably sounds extremely familiar. But I would say that in this latest review cycle and in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine and the ramping up of tensions between Russia and China, the ongoing modernization programs that we're seeing with all of the nuclear armed states, spending billions of dollars on revitalizing their nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. There's, the increasing of threats that we're seeing, the new US nuclear posture review, the other postures and buildups of other nuclear armed states, tensions in the Korean Peninsula. All of this is definitely building in a certain direction, which is not at all good news. And it's moving away from the stated intention of the NPT when it was adopted in 1970 and came into force in 1970, which was supposed to lead to the elimination of nuclear weapons. The arms control agreements between the Soviet Union and Russia and the United States were supposed to lead to nuclear disarmament. And instead, we've seen a retrenchment in nuclear deterrence theory and an increase in tensions and sort of reification of nuclear weapons as essential for security. It's in this context that the rest of the international community, the vast majority of states, along with civil society and international organizations like the Red Cross, as well as some academic institutions, work together to pursue a ban on nuclear weapons. Sort of starting in 2010, after that review conference of the NPT, coming out of that moment feeling like if that was the best we could get, it's not good enough to save humanity and to actually achieve the full elimination of nuclear weapons. And so the idea behind pursuing a ban was to finally put nuclear weapons in the same legal category as other WMD, such as chemical and biological weapons, and also following the models of the bans on landmines and cluster munitions. And I think it's particularly important to understand the sort of history there, because these were sort of a new approach to disarmament, a humanitarian approach to disarmament, in which not all major users and producers were sold on the idea to begin with, were aggressively opposed to these treaties, but we could see the ways in which these weapons were having grave humanitarian impacts around the world. And so, as with those instruments, it was really civil society that tried to convene like-minded governments to build momentum and build a movement for a ban on nuclear weapons, starting with some small group meetings that were very cross-regional, building ideas, building confidence, building a sense of community among those who wanted to pursue this kind of legal action against nuclear weapons. There were some global conferences focusing on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, commissioning new research on the impacts of the use or the testing of nuclear weapons, including in the context of what we know now about climate change. So updating a lot of studies that have been done, say in the 1960s or in the 1980s, and bringing in new information. Looking at the long-lasting effects that have happened from the over 2,000 nuclear weapons tests that have happened around the world, learning from survivors and affected communities in those areas, and building up around the world capacity within government systems of countries that didn't normally speak out on nuclear weapons and that had been silenced and marginalized within nuclear weapons debates and discourse for many, many years, and making space at the table for those voices to not just be heard, but to actually set the agenda and lead. So this process to develop the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was really also an exercise in international democracy, using the body of the UN General Assembly, in which every country has a right to vote, instead of consensus-based forums in which the nuclear armed states dominate and shut anything down that doesn't accord to their priorities and policies. Now, of course, there was intense pressure to prevent this treaty from coming into being. The nuclear armed states all tried to pressure former colonies in particular, but putting pressure economically and politically on countries of the global south in particular to prevent this from happening. The United States forbade NATO members from participating in the negotiations, with the understanding that this treaty would affect nuclear deterrence and nuclear sharing arrangements, and so wanted to make it clear to NATO members that this was incompatible with their obligations as a NATO state, was the argument that they made, and tried at every angle to prevent this treaty from coming to fruition. Now that it does exist, they have ridiculed and condemned the treaty. They say they'll never join it, which is an interesting statement for supposed democracies to make. But one thing that's very clear to us from the strong reactions it's received from the nuclear armed states all the way through, from before it existed to now that it does exist, is that they know it will be an effective treaty in terms of compelling nuclear disarmament. It's not something that will do so overnight. But it's already having an impact in terms of the changing discourse around nuclear weapons, the participation in the debate around nuclear weapons, of who is getting heard, how media is covering this issue. It's had an impact on stigmatization at city levels, at the levels of parliamentary debate, and also hitting where it hurts economically. There's been big divestment campaigns in many of the nuclear armed states and in the NATO states to compel financial institutions and cities and others to remove their money from nuclear weapon producing companies. And so there's a range of activities that have been enabled by the international law prohibiting nuclear weapons, or that have been facilitated by this new treaty, in terms of awareness raising and in terms of practical impacts that we can have on nuclear weapons. And I'm going to leave it to Zia to talk more about what's in the treaty and what happened at the first meeting of states parties this June. But I think what's really exciting about this instrument is that it's a treaty that is designed by the governments and peoples affected by nuclear weapons that have usually not been heard on these issues. So it's a very innovative piece of international law, but also the process to achieve it was new and exciting in the world of nuclear weapons. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ray, for your wonderful updates on the NPT review conference and the issues that have come up throughout the years to implement its initial goals. There was a lot to unpack also about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the challenges of those who favor either of these treaties to one another. Next on the panel, we have Zia Mian, who's going to inform us about the components of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons to a larger extent, and update us on the first meeting of the TPNW state parties, which was held earlier this June. Zia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. So my task here very briefly is to walk you through some of the processes that were in play during the first meeting of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So the context in which the meeting took place, as was mentioned earlier, is perhaps very different from what anybody imagined necessarily at the time when the treaty was agreed at the United Nations in 2017 and when it entered into force in early 2021. And that's because of the COVID pandemic and the delays in the scheduling of the first meeting of the states that are party to this new treaty. And as you all know, this year we've seen the return of very clear nuclear threats as part of the practice of national security by nuclear armed states, where President Putin of Russia has made fairly explicit nuclear threats as part of using his nuclear weapons as a shield for his war of aggression against Ukraine, where he talked about using all means at our disposal. And President Biden has said that, as far as he can see, even the use of a tactical nuclear weapon is possibly likely to end up with what he called Armageddon. And we know also that from US Strategic Command, who have gone on the record saying that in their Global Thunder nuclear war exercises, and I quote, "It ends the same way every time. It does, it ends bad," and the bad meaning it ends with global nuclear war. And this was General John Hyten, the head of Strategic Command, describing these nuclear war exercises. So this speaks very much to the set of concerns that were the impulse for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the struggle to achieve it over this long period of time. So going into the rest of my remarks, let me just say quickly, so the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is a very simple treaty. It's much closer in design to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty than it is to the very elaborate, complex treaties that the United States and Russia, and before that the United States and the Soviet Union negotiated with regard to arms control, because in those bilateral arms control treaties, both sides were committed to maintaining their nuclear weapons capacities with the treaty in force. So there were a lot of things that had to be balanced in managing the negotiations and verification and outcomes of those treaties, whereas the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is a much simpler treaty in its ambitions and in its design. So there are currently more than 90 signatories of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And it says in its fundamental obligations that states that join the treaty cannot develop, test, produce, manufacture, acquire nuclear weapons. So it is a blanket prohibition on all of those activities. And the implication of develop and test is one of the things that takes the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons beyond the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty speaks to the possession of nuclear weapons and assistance in acquiring nuclear weapons. And it has a set of safeguards for countries that don't have nuclear weapons with regard to some of their nuclear material activities, but there is no clear prohibition on developing nuclear weapons in the NPT because it doesn't actually specify that as an issue. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons also breaks radically new ground in that it actually prohibits both the use of nuclear weapons and it prohibits the threat to use nuclear weapons under any circumstances. And this therefore constitutes the first international legal instrument available to states that actually makes them forbidden from being able to adopt a policy of nuclear deterrence. So for states that join the treaty, nuclear deterrence is no longer a legal option for their national security planning purposes. The treaty also says that if countries that host nuclear weapons at the time they join this treaty, should they do so, and there are currently a small number of countries, 5 countries that host nuclear weapons. They all host US nuclear weapons. Those countries are Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. That should any of those countries that host nuclear weapons join the treaty, they must ensure the prompt removal of these weapons and the return of these weapons to the country of origin. The treaty is open to countries that with nuclear weapons and not just hosting nuclear weapons should they join. And what that treaty says with regard to them is that they must remove their nuclear weapons from operation and destroy these nuclear weapons as quickly as possible. But it goes beyond this by embedding that obligation as part of a broader obligation to eliminate their nuclear weapon programs and their facilities through a verifiable time-bound plan, which is to be implemented in cooperation with competent international authorities. And so that means that there has to be international inspection processes that are involved in this. And the treaty also has what are called positive obligations, which are specifically to provide assistance to victims and to remediate the environment that has been harmed by the past use of nuclear weapons and by the testing of nuclear weapons, because a significant number of countries that are parties to the treaty and were involved in the negotiation were former colonial territories that were affected by the testing of nuclear weapons by the 9 nuclear weapon states that are today. The treaty recognizes that by itself, it may not be able to achieve the complete irreversible elimination of all nuclear weapons as in one step, and it allows for additional protocols to be negotiated to add to the scope and implementation of this treaty. So there are things that could be done in addition to what is in the treaty to meet the goal of nuclear disarmament. And so quickly turning to what took place at the treaty meeting, what we had there was a very interesting encounter. One of the things that the treaty includes is that states that join the treaty commit to encourage others who are not parties to the treaty to sign, ratify, and accept the treaty. In other words, the goal is to make it universal. And there's been a big struggle between the 9 nuclear weapon states and now the 90 countries that are treaty members of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons over how to establish an understanding of what the treaty means in the world. The US and some of its allies have said that none of the NATO countries and any country under the US nuclear umbrella should be open to joining this treaty. And the US actually went further in that it actually wrote a letter to all the countries that have already signed and ratified the treaty to say that, and I quote, "We believe that you have made a strategic error and should withdraw your instrument of ratification or accession. In other words, the United States called on countries to unsign a treaty banning nuclear weapons. At the same time, 56 former presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, and defense ministers, including from 20 NATO member states, as well as Japan and South Korea, have called on the current leaders of their countries to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And the signatories of this letter include 2 former NATO Secretary Generals. So there's a lot of contention going on at very high levels in many, many countries about joining the treaty. So in Vienna, at the first meeting of states parties, 83 countries showed up, including some countries that are in NATO and are part of the US nuclear alliance, including Finland, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Norway. 2 of these countries, Germany and Netherlands, actually host US nuclear weapons. And it was a significant step that these are countries that are both part of the US nuclear alliance structure and yet feel that they can be part of the TPNW community, even if they're not ready to sign the treaty at this time. And there were hundreds of representatives from universities, civil society, and especially communities harmed by the US and testing of nuclear weapons. And they agreed a sweeping declaration about nuclear weapons and a detailed 50-point action plan on what they can do going forward. And they agreed that the second meeting of states parties will take place in New York in late 2023 and is to be chaired by Mexico. And this will be an opportunity for many people in the United States to come to New York and to see how the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons actually works in practice. So just to wrap up quickly now, at this first meeting, the Vienna Declaration made by these countries that are parties to the treaty said quite explicitly how they understand where they are now with this treaty. And the declaration says that in their view, nuclear weapons are now explicitly and comprehensively prohibited by international law, because until the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, there was no international legal instrument as such that bans nuclear weapons or the use of nuclear weapons or the threat of use of nuclear weapons. This treaty constitutes that first international instrument and is therefore part of international law. They also said that very clearly that any use or threat of use of nuclear weapons under any circumstances is to be condemned, whether this threat is explicit or implicit and irrespective of the circumstances. And this was seen as a very strong condemnation of the threats made by Russia, and it constitutes the strongest multilateral condemnation of the Russian nuclear threats since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. It also expressed very clear opposition to the nuclear modernization plans being undertaken by the 9 countries with nuclear weapons in the world. It also made the case for and accepted the establishment of an international trust fund for assisting with people harmed by nuclear testing and use in the past, and for the remediation of the environments harmed by nuclear testing and use in the past. And it created a scientific advisory group to advise them on how to take the treaty forward and deal with some of the scientific and technical issues that remain to be addressed and will arise going forward, especially with regard to issues of victim assistance, environmental remediation, and the verification aspects of the treaty. So the 50-point action plan covers many, many aspects. And one of the things it does is it explicitly lays down a concrete set of tasks for the states parties to undertake, especially in this first year, on making sure that they can begin to create a step-by-step implementation process that covers all the elements of the treaty in detail. And working groups of states have been set up to begin to work through each of the articles of the treaty and bring them into force and make them do work in the world going forward. But I think that with that, I will wrap up, since there are lots of questions, and just make it clear that this is only the beginning of a treaty process. It's worth remembering that when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was agreed in 1970, there was no comprehensive system of international safeguards that the treaty called for. It took several years for the International Atomic Energy Agency to actually create the system that we now call safeguards and actually begin to bring it into practice. And so the fact that the treaty is still only at the beginning in dealing with some of the verification issues that it has put in place is fairly typical of past practice in this regard. And the larger issue that we have to deal with is that there continues to be contention between the 9 countries with nuclear weapons and some of their allies trying to restrain, constrain, and make the TPNW go away, and the many countries of the TPNW trying to establish that they are here, the treaty is here, it was made in the valid process for making international treaties, and that they now do have more than 91 signatories. And so the issue will be how the struggle between these parts of the world community will play itself out over the next year and coming years against a background of both the threats of using nuclear weapons, the modernization of nuclear weapons, and this commitment to the prohibition of nuclear weapons in all their aspects. With that, I will end my remarks.
Thank you so much, Sia, for the thorough summary of what came out of the first meeting of the TPNW state parties, as well as how different state actors and international organizations or other actors are responding to these developments. I want to open up the floor to questions shortly, but before that, I was wondering if Ray or Randy had anything to add, or if any of the panelists had any questions for each other. If not, we have some questions that were submitted to us prior to the meeting and some questions that are coming in, and we can go to them.
I think fine to go to the questions that folks are asking.
Fantastic. So we have some questions that were submitted to us before the meeting, before the webinar started. I'm gonna start with one of those. This one came from Sahu Narayan. And the question is it possible to eliminate all WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, by a global civil movement, which I think was briefly mentioned through how the TPNW came to being, but I'll leave it to our panelists to respond to that question.
I can begin an answer to that question if I understand it correctly. It's worth remembering that there already exist international legal treaties banning chemical weapons and biological weapons. And so 2 of the 3 kinds of weapon systems that are typically covered by the umbrella term weapons of mass destruction are already banned under international legal processes. And now the TPNW bans nuclear weapons. So I think the answer to the question is that's already been done now. The issue is not whether such a ban exists. The issue is what do we do about the countries that have not joined that international legal prohibition on chemical weapons, biological weapons, and now nuclear weapons. So the ban as a legal obligation does exist, and it is open to countries to join it. But the way the international law works is that you can't force countries to join nuclear weapons or other kinds of treaties should they not wish to do so. They don't even have to join the United Nations system should they not wish to do so. So the issue is not whether the bans exist. They do exist now for chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons. The issue is what to do with the countries that choose not to join these bans.
If I can just add a little bit to that, I would say that the role of civil society movements or activist movements, given that these treaties do exist, is really through the stigmatization of any use of these weapons, or in the case of, which we are seeing with chemical weapons in current situations, and also the threat of use of nuclear weapons that we're seeing now as well with Russia. Not to mention nuclear deterrence theory at large, which is an implicit threat to use nuclear weapons and a preparedness to use them. So I think that's the role of civil society in terms of stigmatizing this behavior that is out of conformity with international law and working to encourage or compel our governments to join these treaties, which do exist. And so that's where that's where the effort has been made in terms of creating these instruments already. And now that they do exist, it's about their implementation and about adherence to them.
Great. That actually might be a good segue to two of the questions that I'm going to combine together. So folks are asking if there are any concrete actions. This question came from Adam Lazy. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If there are any concrete actions that have been undertaken as a result of the treaty, which I'm assuming is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. For instance, weapons destroyed, programs canceled, etc. And we also have a question from Robert Hayes, who is asking about solutions. Can we start discussing paths to progress? He's asking.
So I can begin that again, if that's all right, since they address the components of the TPNW. So far, because none of the 9 countries with nuclear weapons have actually joined the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, they have not undertaken any changes in nuclear posture, planning, or their arsenals or their programs because of the existence of the treaty. With regard to the 5 states that host nuclear weapons, that would also have specific obligations under the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, since none of them have actually joined the treaty yet, they're not legally bound to do anything with regard to that either. Right now, as I mentioned in my remarks, we're just starting to see the breaking of the ranks within countries and between countries on how to think about their policies towards the existence of the treaty. So some countries are trying to destroy the treaty. As I mentioned, the US tried to get countries to unsign it. Other countries are saying we want nothing to do with it. And some countries are now starting to say, well, we'll come and talk to you about what you're doing. And in some cases, they've said, look, we are ready to try and help. So at the first meeting of states parties in Vienna, some of the countries that came, including NATO member states that came, actually said, we can try and help with the assistance towards victims harmed by nuclear weapons use and testing in the past, and the issue of environmental remediation, because we think we have capabilities and resources that might be useful to help you implement the treaty and deal with communities and ecosystems that have been harmed. So in those countries, we're seeing a positive attitude towards some parts of the treaty. So I think it's a very mixed set of indicators at this stage, but Ray and Randy may have other things to say about what it means for countries to deal with treaties that they're not actually part of yet.
Yeah, I think another area where we're seeing progress is in how some of the governments of countries that are in nuclear security relationships with the United States are approaching the treaty. So as I mentioned in my remarks, the US instructed NATO members, for example, not to attend the negotiations and to not to join the treaty if it was concluded. And for the most part, that they followed that instruction. The Netherlands was the only NATO country to participate in the negotiations, and it only did so because it was actually compelled by its parliament to participate in negotiations. But now with the first meeting of states parties, we actually saw some NATO members, including Norway and Germany, and then some countries that have since joined NATO, like Sweden and Finland, actually participate in the meeting. Australia also came as well as an observer to the first meeting of states parties. And at the General Assembly in October, Australia, for the first time, abstained on the resolution there that is supporting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that's the first time that a country that has this quote unquote extended nuclear deterrence arrangement with the United States has not voted against resolution dealing with the TPNW. So we are seeing some shifts and cracks, which is due to organizing within those countries, protests about their government policies, organizing with parliamentarians within parties in power as well as within opposition parties to force debates and to really open up the conversation about the relationship of their governments with nuclear weapons. So like Zia said, this is a new beginning, right? We're at the very start of this process. And so it's really exciting to watch some of this open up. It's easy to get frustrated at how slow things can be. But at the moment, the treaty is a new element in the world that governments are forced to contend with, and those relationships are starting to change.
If I might just add one thing, since there will be people on the webinar who are based in the United States, there has been a lot of activity within the United States, not all of it at the federal level, since not all policy only is made in Washington, but at the state level, there have been resolutions by state legislatures, including Oregon and I think California and New Jersey, where I am in Princeton, where the state legislature has actually passed resolutions in support of nuclear arms control, the goal of nuclear disarmament, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and sent letters to the White House and to Congress saying that on behalf of the people of the state, their elected officials at the state level have passed on this set of aspirations and goals of their citizens. And there are also similar kinds of activities organized at city level, with many US cities passing resolutions in support of progress on nuclear arms control, on achieving nuclear disarmament, and in support of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so, this is the beginning of all of that kind of process at many, many levels within the US, and as Ray was mentioning, in other countries also, to make people aware even of the existence of this treaty, because it is amazing how little coverage the first treaty banning nuclear weapons actually gets in the US mainstream media. And secondly, the fact that there's a lot of work going on at the grassroots level to bring the treaty and its goals and ideas into the policy process at all levels.
I want to just reinforce what Zia is saying, in particular with respect to cities. Given that I work for Mayors for Peace, it's appropriate that I chime in on that. He's exactly right. Most people do not regard US city mayors as noted for their strong advocacy of nuclear disarmament, but it's a shame because they have been very active. In the last 17 years, the US Conference of Mayors has adopted a resolution strongly supporting nuclear disarmament, strongly supporting the work of my own organization, Mayors for Peace, and also speaking favorably on the TPNW. So it's the city mayors do have an important role. But is that surprising? If these weapons are used, where will they be used? Who are the likely victims? Who's going to pay the price of the use of these weapons? Who's going to put the fires out? All these questions. Cities have a huge stake in this, and I really think they're a very powerful player. One very annoying aspect of the NPT that I feel I didn't adequately address. In 1995, the treaty was extended indefinitely in life. It will continue now without an expiration date. As part of the deal that went into that, there were a number of principles that were decided upon, including several dealing with disarmament. But the slogan at the time was permanence with accountability. And the theme there was that the legitimacy of that treaty will depend completely on the review process and on how well what kind of information states are given that document compliance with that treaty. In 2010, the NPT states parties asked for my office in the UN, the Office of Disarmament Affairs, to create a repository of nuclear weapon information so that the nuclear weapon states could document the steps that they've taken to implement their disarmament commitments. I call on all of you to take a look at the UN's website, www.un.org/disarmament, and look up the word repository and have a look in that repository and see what the kind of information the nuclear weapon states have been providing. The quality of the information is very, very poor. In some cases, it's absent entirely. And so this is another problem that I think the NPT is going to be facing long term in terms of its basic legitimacy in light of this rather poor record of compliance, both with the Article 6 disarmament commitment, but also the transparency and accountability aspects of the treaty. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see that we have a lot more questions coming in, but this is one of the questions that was submitted to us before the webinar started as well, and it has to do with the issue of delivery systems and testing of Minuteman III from Vandenberg, AFB to the Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And the question is that legal?
The question of whether it's legal, since the United States is not a party to the treaty, the United States does not consider it to be illegal, because it has not accepted any obligation with regard to its nuclear weapon related activities. And until somebody challenges that within the larger structure of international law, there is no answer to that question. So there would have to be a process for doing that. I mean, the Marshall Islands could take the United States to the International Court of Justice and actually ask for an opinion on this question, as it has done with regard to issues about the legacy of US nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands in the past. But until the United States accepts for itself a treaty that limits those kinds of activities, the rest of the world can consider that, yeah, this is illegal. But as far as the United States is concerned, it's not illegal, and therefore it doesn't feel prohibited by this. That's just the way that international law works, that until a state signs a treaty, it is not bound by the provisions of that treaty.
Thank you for that explanation, Zia, which I think to some extent responds to this question that came from Chris Galp, which asked, under the TPNW, who's in charge seems undefined. Is this the UN, The Hague? I don't see how this can work, which I think you responded by bringing up the issue of legality. But if there's anyone who wants to add to that, we would appreciate it.
So Randy may be the best person to deal with this question, since the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was made inside the structure of the United Nations system, right? It was the vote at the United Nations General Assembly that said, yes, go ahead, negotiate this treaty. And the rules for negotiating the treaty and what counts as proper process for making international law was followed using UN procedures for making international law. So to that extent, the United Nations is responsible now for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because it is part of the UN structure that enables it and gives it form and content. But Randy, is perhaps best placed to help us understand this question.
With the proviso that the ability of the UN to operate in this field relies extremely heavily upon the willingness of the nuclear weapon states to cooperate and to share similar objectives. I've seen precious little evidence of that. In fact, I've seen a lot of slippage away from that stance. The questioner raised a very important issue, which it pertains to enforcement. It pertains to verification. These are unresolved right now. The meeting of states parties of the TPNW, the treaty itself, clearly suggests that this remains a work in progress, that there's a lot of study that has to be done. There's a lot of negotiations that have to be done. There's a lot of institution building that has to be done in order to establish a credible verification capability to ensure that the solemn provisions of that treaty are in fact being implemented. The world community is not yet does not yet have a consensus on precisely how this can and should be done. There are concerns, for example, that the International Atomic Energy Agency, which administers international safeguards, is focused primarily on fissile material, on measuring quantities, on establishing that they're being used for peaceful purposes. But it is not known as having a vast reservoir of expertise when it comes to nuclear weapon design information or anything dealing with delivery systems or that kind of military aspect of the weaponry. So you're looking at some kind of special future verification agency that will have to have a very intrusive information access about quantities of fissile materials, something that Zia has been working on through the International Panel on Fissile Materials. A lot more information on fissile materials, a lot more information on delivery systems, a lot more information on facilities and structures where these are produced, and of course, data on warheads and bombs that are possessed by countries. It gets very, very difficult to count warheads and bombs when countries are not making either that information available or opening up facilities for inspection. There are a lot of study groups and working groups that are looking at this very closely, including at the UN. We have had groups of governmental experts working for literally decades at the UN on the problem of verification. And there are a number of monographs that have been produced at the UN that addressing that issue. But it is I can't say that there is a panacea for this. That there's no silver bullet. It's going to take a while to iron out all the political and technical problems. But this is what makes it interesting to the people in the Physicians Coalition, because you have skills here that can bring to bear upon helping to verify by measuring fissile material remotely, for example, and by being able to measure it without revealing detailed nuclear weapon design information. These are all technical studies that are going on at the international level. Norway and the UK, for example, have an excellent cooperative arrangement on trying to improve verification. But no, we clearly have a long way to go at the UN and certainly in the international community. And I wish I could point the way to how this will get resolved, but I think it'll be as a result of hard work and a lot of diplomatic compromises.
Thank you so much for that. There are other questions that are coming in, and we don't have a lot of time. So if you could very briefly answer this question, which was submitted to us by Brian Worth. How does PIT remanufacturing plans impact NPT discussions among both weapon states and non-weapon states? Ray or Zia, I don't want to put you on the spot, but would any of you want to answer that?
Yeah, it's interesting what comes up and what doesn't come up at the NPT. So PIT manufacturing is not something that I've heard discussed at an NPT conference since I've been covering it. I don't know if Randy and Zia, you've had a different experience. But it's, because the NPT doesn't prohibit nuclear weapons and so doesn't prohibit outright the possession of nuclear weapons. It says that the nuclear armed states that are party to it are supposed to eliminate their nuclear weapons, but they don't read it that way. So it doesn't say anything about the reconstitution of arsenals. which PIP production is part of. It doesn't say anything about the investments you can make in terms of nuclear weapon facilities and capacities to continue producing nuclear weapons into the indefinite future. So that's what we're seeing right now with nuclear weapon modernization programs. What non-nuclear armed states that are party to the NPT say is that this is a violation of the treaty because Article 6 obligates the nuclear armed states to negotiate and achieve nuclear disarmament, which is what the International Court of Justice ruled in 1996, well, had an advisory opinion about in 1996, is that obligation includes achievement of nuclear disarmament, not just endless, fruitless negotiations. The non-nuclear armed states then use this as a sort of explanation for why things like PIP production would be or should be considered illegal. But that's not how the nuclear armed states read it. And as Zia said, how they read their obligations has an impact on their policies. So in that sense, these issues which do have direct bearing on nuclear disarmament are rarely even discussed in any kind of specificity at NPT meetings.
Thank you so much for that response, Ray. I'm trying to combine these questions sort of together and keep the one regarding what civil society can do for the very last question. So this question is regarding other weapon bans on chemical and biological weapons and basically how effective they've been, and the fact that they're still being researched and produced, and how can we make sure that as long as countries have the technology and the knowledge to build these weapons, that this doesn't happen. And also there was a suggestion on whether or not we can rely on the UN to destroy the weapons and collect these weapons from nuclear weapon states. Very briefly, if you may. Thank you so much.
So I think that this comes to an enduring problem that we've had for a long time in how we think about the relationship between technologies and weapons and society and international law. That what the international community can do is to create international laws. And as Randy mentioned in his remarks at the beginning, it is up to states when they join those international instruments to put into place domestic legislation and processes and policies that turn that legal obligation into specific requirements that are at work within their national legal and policy and social structure, and make it part of their culture, right? That, yeah, we are people who've accepted this, and this is what we should be doing, and this is what we shouldn't be doing. And we have the same attitude towards terrorism. We have the same attitude towards weapons, and we have the same attitude towards torture and lots of other things, that there are international conventions that forbid these things. And so we shouldn't be doing this. And there are specific laws that are at play within countries on how to deal with these kinds of questions. And so just because something may be theoretically possible for a technologist to do, right, it's up to that country's own legal and political structure and its social structures to make sure that everybody in that society knows that these are not things that good people should be thinking about doing, that they will be caught and punished if they try and do these things, because their society and their government has accepted that we will not do this. And so I think you can't just imagine that there is nothing in between the technology and the international law. There is in fact everything between that technology and international law, and that is all of actually existing societies, laws, decisions, and processes that shape everyday life and all the many things that we do. We don't always get it right. I mean, we know there are laws about murder and people still get killed. There are laws about many things, and those laws are broken by some people, but everybody agrees that there is actually a structure of laws that are there, and we need to work at making sure that they are actually followed and implemented, and that people who try and break them are punished. And that importantly, that people understand in advance that this is not something that you should even be wanting to do. And so this speaks to Ray's point about stigmatization, about getting people to understand that these technologies, just because they are terrible, are not desirable. Because they are terrible, they should be shunned by decent people in every possible way. And so that's part of the larger process that is underway with regard to chemical weapons, biological weapons, and now nuclear weapons.
Thank you so much for that response and for bringing back stigmatization for both to get both countries or states to join these treaties and like these pieces of legislation and to make sure that they're implemented. So that I think kind of like brings us full circle with this final question, which asked about remarks by Presidents Biden and Xi in Bali about nuclear weapons. And the question is about the about how the civil society can basically influence the US government, but I'm going to extend that in general, especially if you could respond to that, given the context of this webinar and the audience of this webinar. How can members of the coalition or scientist citizens stigmatize the use of nuclear weapons? I know that Zia, we also have like an action plan going on. There's a statement in which we're asking scientists to condemn the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. So if you could speak on that action and how actions like that can help move this process along.
Yeah, so thank you, Chris, and thank you, Cheryl, for the question. It absolutely does fall on us to try and make the Washington policy process, or whatever is the policy process wherever we happen to live. And here I want to come back to what Randy was saying, that it doesn't all begin and end in Washington, DC, and in the office of the president or in Congress. There are many places where policy and politics can actually make a difference between the ordinary person and all the way up to whoever sits in the Oval Office. And so one of the things I would encourage people to think about is that don't just think about what can we do to get the US government to move. You don't have to go directly to Washington to make the US government move. The first thing to do is to make Washington understand that there are people who are interested and concerned and are paying attention and want something different. And for that, we need to organize collective voices, collective action. And so the new statement that is open for signature that is being circulated by the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction calls on scientists to add their voice to the many other voices in the world right now, including that of President Biden and now President Xi, but also 145 countries that were at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference that was discussed earlier in August, who said that any use of nuclear weapons should be condemned and any threat to use nuclear weapons should be condemned. And so we thought that it's important that scientists add their voice, that we too believe that any threat to use nuclear weapons, which are weapons of mass destruction, that we should condemn in advance, that threatening to use such weapons is absolutely unacceptable. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do, to make a common voice so that everybody knows that ordinary people, scientists and others think that this is not an acceptable way of thinking about how to defend your country or to use nuclear weapons as a shield for your war of aggression like Putin is doing in Ukraine. So joining organizations, speaking up, and working at every possible level that you have access to show that you believe that nuclear weapons have no role in our society or in the world is a place to start. And the Physicists Coalition offers one opportunity for people to join with others committed to that effort, to learn more and to find out about opportunities to get action and to get involved. But Ray, who's active in many, many levels in many, many countries and many, many different institutions, and Randy also have a lifetime of experience in how to understand and to make policy move at many, many levels. And I'm sure they have things to add.
In addition to the coalition letter that Zia was talking about, I would recommend people check out the ICANN Cities Appeal. So that's work Zia mentioned earlier at both state and city level that we've done. So that's it. I can't share links in the chat with you, but maybe Chris will circulate links after But that's one initiative. Don't Bank on the Bomb is another ongoing initiative that is about divestment of nuclear weapons, or money from nuclear weapon producing companies. We have the ICANN Parliamentary Pledge, which is about, and the Congressional Pledge for the US, which is about getting members of Parliament or Congress or the Senate to speak out against nuclear weapons, that has had traction in many of the nuclear armed or nuclear allied countries like NATO countries. So there's a lot of different initiatives that are underway right now that are really practical that people can engage with at many levels. That's my quick response.
One of the activities that we do at Mayors for Peace is to promote very actively the role of young people in through our disarmament education activities. The UN Office of Disarmament Affairs also has their own education office, which has a site where you can go to get syllabuses and reading lists and notes for possible classes and all kinds of useful instructional information. The unspoken assumption driving all this is that, frankly, despite all of our best efforts, a lot of this work is going to have to pass on to the next generation because of the kinds of obstacles that we've been documenting today in this webinar. The obstacles are horrific and daunting, but should not scare people away from having an impact on them. And I would just like to come back to this theme of disarmament education about being a vital role in the future of coming up with a new generation of people that enter this business and bring their own skills to bear. I think that the interest that the members of this coalition have taken on specifically the issue of nuclear disarmament is a very encouraging sign, and I'm delighted to remember one thing. In the United States, the earliest advocates of against nuclear weapons were physicists. It was a group of scientists in the Manhattan Project that signed letters that calling for no use of nuclear weapons and warning of the danger of a world arms race. Albert Einstein, one of the greatest physicists of all, joined with the Russell-Einstein joint declaration in the mid-1950s. The theme of that was remember your humanity and forget all the rest. I want to emphasize that physicists have in the past had a vital, important role in this business, and I expect that they will continue to do so. And I just salute everything you're doing, and I wish you well.
Thank you so much, Randy, for those final remarks. Thank you again to all three of you, Randy Rydell, Zia Mian, and Ray Atchison, for joining us today for this timely webinar. Thank you all for joining us and participating and engaging by asking very critical questions. You can go to our website, physicistcoalition.org/join to stay updated on future actions or events. Again, thank you all for joining and for being with us today. A recording of this session will also be shared with you. And on that note, I hope everybody has a good rest of their day, and we'll see you soon.